Hello. Again, this is Mr. Hefner, and today we're going to take a look at a very short speech which has been titled Ain't I a Woman? And it's by Sojourner Truth. Now, Sojourner Truth did not title this speech herself. This was a speech that was given extemporaneously. It was given without a text, off the top of her head, to a crowd. And a recorder, a human recorder, wrote the speech down. And Ain't I a Woman is a line that's going to show up several times. It's repeated for emphasis throughout the speech, and so it makes for a perfect title. So let's get started. So with this speech today, our lesson essential question is going to be, what are the characteristics and legacy of Sojourner Truth's speeches? You might recall in ninth grade, if you took ninth grade college prep, you might have read another speech by Sojourner Truth, which was given to a convention on equal rights. And in that speech, she was speaking for the rights of women. She's also going to be speaking for the rights of women in this speech as well. So we're going to take a look at what makes this a speech, as opposed to something like an essay, and what her legacy is. Now, if we were in class today working together, we would use the reader's journal, maybe draft something quickly and then talk about it. But that question would have been, if someone belittled you for something outside your control, such as your race or sex or religion, how would you react? And I think this question is set up to put us all on the right page of what does it feel like to be the person who's discriminated against, the person who's on the outside. And that's what we want to think about as we read what Sojourner Truth had to say. So let's find out a little bit about old Sojourner here. So she's our author, and there you see her dates, 1797 to 1883. And again, you see that C in front of 1797 that we've talked about before. The C again stands for circa, and it means around. We're not completely sure what Sojourner's birth year was, and neither was she. You see, she was born a slave in New York State, and slave birth dates were not always recorded. So she guessed she was born around 1797. Her birth name was Isabella Baumfree. Baumfree would have been the name of her owner in New York State, and Isabella was the name given to her at birth. When she was under 10 years old, you can see that she was sold at auction, split from her family, and sold to another owner. She was a slave until 1828, and she escaped slavery not by running away, not because of the Civil War, because the Civil War doesn't start until 1861, but she was freed as part of the New York Anti-Slavery Act. And this was the act that did away with all slavery in New York State, but it did it in stages. It did not release everybody from slavery at the same time. Slaves were released from slavery based on different requirements, such as age. Now, she was the first African American ever to take a white man to court. Now, that's a big deal, because in the old days, women weren't even allowed to appear in court. They had to have lawyers that did it for them. And so here she is, a freed slave, a black person, and a woman, and she's taking a white man to court. So she was way ahead of her time when it came to civil rights. She changed her own name in 1843 to Sojourner Truth. She believed she was speaking the truth, and that made for a great last name. And to sojourn is to travel a while to another place. And she wanted people to spend a little time with the truth. She could not read and write. Again, she was born a slave, and it was illegal in most places to teach slaves to read and write, and they certainly didn't get a public education. And as people get older, it becomes harder to learn to read and write than when you're young. She never learned. Many of her speeches were written down, and she has an autobiography. She dictated the story to a recorder who wrote it down for her. Later on, she was able to save up enough money to buy her own home, so she became a property owner, which was also an outstanding and unusual thing at that time. She was a preacher, in addition to being a civil rights worker, and she raised money for the Union cause during the Civil War by going around and preaching both religion and abolitionist ideas. She wanted, after the Civil War, to open the Western lands for freed slaves. With millions of people being freed from slavery, where do they go? What do they do? And she believed that if they stayed where they were, they would essentially just, and they did, they became sharecroppers and continued just simply to work for the people who once owned them. She wanted the Western land opened up and free plots of land given to slaves who moved west. During her life, for someone who was born a slave, she achieved an awful lot. She met Abraham Lincoln. She met Frederick Douglass, and we've read and studied Frederick Douglass already. And she met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who we've talked about, but we're not going to read, was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, probably the singular most influential novel during the time period of the Civil War. Our literary tools for this unit are going to be literary tools that relate especially to speeches. And first and foremost is going to be repetition. When you're giving a speech, it's important that you make sure that your listener hear the most important things. And the best way to do that is to repeat things. You can repeat a sound, you can repeat a word, a phrase, a rhyme, anything that will drive home key ideas. Next is your argument. In a speech, you're generally in a persuasive mode rather than an informative mode, and your argument is your case for accepting or rejecting your position. You're trying to get others on board with the way you think, and you're going to use a rhetorical strategy in order to build your argument. Now, here's something that's not always part of a speech. It's the term colloquialism. Colloquialism means using the ordinary, common, relaxed, everyday speech. And Sojourner Truth is going to speak to these people not as some university-educated PhD. She is going to speak to them as a friend. She's going to speak to them in ordinary, everyday language, very relaxed and informal. And that affects her tone as well. Her tone is emotional in this speech. She definitely believes in her cause, but she's going to use anecdotes and stories and examples told in a very plain, common folk sort of way. Now, about this particular speech, the Ain't I a Woman speech, she gave it in 1851 at a women's rights convention in Ohio. And as I said before, she was an emancipated slave, but in 1851, slavery still existed in the entire South. So we don't know exactly if these are the words she gave. Many speeches, from a long time ago were written down by somebody, and we have to trust the person who recorded them. And this particular speech that we have even includes her dialect and her way of speaking. So I kind of trust this one. Now, there's a picture of Sojourner Truth. And she made money by, if you take a look at the card on the right, very similar kind of picture, but that is what was called a carte de visite, or sometimes just a CDV. During the time period around the Civil War, photographs had finally started to become affordable for everyday people, and they had developed a way that they could print the picture on paperboard, kind of like a greeting card or a postcard today. Sojourner Truth would give speeches, and then she would have stacks of these cartes, I don't even know what the plural would be, carte de visites, we'll just say CDVs, and she would sell those to people who would keep them as souvenirs. Obviously, she could not autograph them because she could not read and write. And she made it on a United States postage stamp to celebrate Black heritage. I'm having a terrible time here today. All right, what I want you to do right now is read the selection and then come back. So as always, this is the point in the presentation where you pause the video. Go read the speech, and when you're finished, come back here, and you can resume the video, and we'll go over the check for understanding questions. If you take a look in Schoology, there may be a link there for a YouTube video of an actor portraying Sojourner Truth and giving this speech. You might also want to take a look at that before you return here. All right, I'm going to wait. You pause me, and I'll be here when you get back. All right, you're back. I'm glad you watched the video, too. That was a good thing to do. All right, let's take a look at the questions. Sojourner Truth directly addresses arguments from Yes, evidently two men in the audience had shouted something out or spoke to her, and she felt the need to address those concerns in an impromptu, spur of the moment kind of way in her speech. The tone of this speech may best be described as, I hope you went with challenging on this one. That's what she's doing. She is challenging the status quo. She is speaking up for the rights of women. Sojourner Truth offers an allusion to the biblical story of the Garden of Eden to illustrate what? Now, an allusion is a literary reference to something people already know. People at that time probably knew Bible stories very well, and so she makes a reference. Why does she do that? Yes, she wants to show that just as Eve influenced Adam, women are capable of influencing men. Here's one of those questions about when she addresses one of the two men in the crowd. She points out to, and she calls him that little man in black, she points out that Christ what? Again, a biblical reference. She points out that Christ was born of a woman. So you can't say men are all that, because there wouldn't be any men in existence if it weren't for women. All right, this was a pretty short presentation for a very short speech. After you close this window, be sure to go back to Schoology and check for any related assignments or for any further reading. Thanks for staying with me, and I'll see you at the next lesson.